Hey everyone, Mr. Ham here. I am here to talk to you today about the Spanish-American War. So, going along with what I'm going to be talking about today is this worksheet here. So it's going to be similar to what we did yesterday. So it's a PDF, and you're going to need to open that up with Cami. And then the instructions on here, it's going to be going from Cuba here, a little bit in the Philippines, and then Treaty of Paris. And then you need to connect these two men with the conflict they are involved in. Then down here is the question of the Philippine annexation, and you just need to draw a line for each of these, and then write a quick little note here on the results of the annexation debate. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with the Spanish-American War, which is also known as the Splendid Little War. So like we talked about yesterday with yellow journalism and kind of the build-up to this war, there's a lot of public support for this war. So it's a very popular war for protecting these poor Cubans, in the mind of these Americans, these Cubans that are being oppressed by Spanish. And you can see this cartoon is really kind of showing that as well. You have Uncle Sam here representing the United States and America's interest, and he is shielding this poor Cuban woman with the American flag. So it's very kind of on the nose. He's even got Cuba written down here, so you know exactly where he's at. And again, that's the sentiment of this time period is this idea that the United States is the savior of the world. So keep that in mind kind of as we're going through this presentation, kind of that public policy and public mindset. So this is a very quick war. It only lasted 5 months, and it was fought in two places, Cuba and the Philippines. So we talked a little bit about Cuba, with kind of the build-up to this war, but the Philippines were another Spanish colony over near Asia. And if you look at your map, you can see exactly where the Philippines are. So even though it only lasts 5 years, the impacts of this can be felt for years after, and there's still political impacts of this war today. So the war starts over in the Philippines. So the Philippines are an island that Spain has had the control of since the 1500s. So it is absolutely a Spanish colony. They speak Spanish there. Spanish assets are all over that place. And so the first person that kind of encounters this is a guy named Commodore George Dewey. He's the man in charge of the U.S. fleet over in the Pacific. So he was put in charge of it by Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy warns Dewey that if war is going to break out, he should attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. So don't be passive. You need to be aggressive and attack the Spanish in the Philippines. And that's exactly what he does. So, once Dewey receives the word of the declaration of war, his troops rush to Manila Bay. So, Manila, if you remember back to our Sam Arrington and the stories about the bully and the hero, he replaces the Spanish notes in the Manila folder. Well, that's representing Manila Bay here in the Philippines. So, Manila Bay, the Spanish started to open fire, but they were far out of range, so they weren't too far away. They waited and did not want to waste the United States waited and didn't want to waste ammunition, so they basically were waiting for them to come. And their nearest resupply point was in California, so it took a long time for these supplies to get out there. Remember, one of the reasons that people wanted to be imperialized, wanted to imperialize other countries, was because of these ports and these locations for recharging. And they didn't really have that in the Pacific. So the nearest resupply point was all the way in California, and so they were kind of low already. And so here is another representation. So we saw a little bit yesterday of some of these newspapers. You can see Dewey smashes Spain's fleet. Great naval battle between Asiatic Squadron and Spanish warships off Manila. So again, it's a very positive war. People are very much into this war on behalf of the United States, seeing them as the savior, seeing them as the heroes of this story. So, what's the result of this? Well, the United States had an advantage. They had modern ships, while the Spanish had old wooden ships. So, the United States was kind of on the cutting edge of shipbuilding technology at this time, and they crush the Spanish. Their weapons superior, everything is superior except really these supply lines. So they start running low on ammunition, and they kind of have to pull their punches. So they have to pull back and kind of redistribute and re-engage at that point. But in the end, the fighting continued, and soon the Spanish fleets were ablaze and sinking. So even though they didn't have the supplies necessary to get that knockout punch right away, they were eventually able to win this conflict with relative ease because of the might of the American Navy at this time. And just for your guys' knowledge, this is the first real major American naval move. We had not really ever dealt with a navy, and this is the first time the American Navy has ever really done much on the world stage. So it's kind of an interesting area that it kind of starts at this time period with the Spanish-American War. So, no Americans die in this war, or in this battle, excuse me, amazingly. And you can see this representation over here, this painting, and you can see the American ships over here. They look a lot closer to like steamers like the Titanic, or even warships of the 20th century, whereas the Spanish boats were more similar to those old wooden ships that you would see, like maybe in pirate movies and stuff like that. The Spaniards, 400 of them were injured or killed in this battle. So this is a devastating blow to the Spanish. The majority of their navy, along with 400 soldiers, were killed in this battle, with no Americans lost. So again, remember, this is a 5-month war, and this is a major part of why it went over so quickly. So, Dewey, he looks to the mainland of the Philippines, and what he wants to do is he wants to attack the capital city there in Manila. So, Aguinaldo is this guy over here, Emilio Aguinaldo, and he was joined by the leader of he joined Dewey as the leader of the rebel Philippine army. So, just like in Cuba, the Philippines had a very strong kind of independence movement going on, and Emilio Aguinaldo was the head of that. And so they joined forces with the Americans. And so while the U.S. sits in the harbor in their boats and their safety, the rebel army does most of the work on the ground in the Philippines. So it's these rebels led by Aguinaldo in the Philippines that actually ends up doing most of the fighting on the island of the Philippines. So they eventually capture the capital, which leads to their victory, and the Spanish surrender the Philippines on August 14th, 1898. So this question remains. We're going to push this back to the end of this, but should the U.S. allow Philippine independence, or should they annex the territory? So basically, should we allow them to be their own country, create their own government, or should we take them over? And this will be debated, and we're going to talk about this coming up. So consider this question. What factors led to the swift U.S. victory in the Philippines? I'll give you a few seconds here. Just think through that, maybe look at your notes, and see what we just talked about. So, if we remember, if we recall a little bit about what we just talked about, the United States had a superior navy. The technology was better, the weaponry was better, and we were on the offensive. So the United States was able to crush this Spanish navy that was outdated and outgunned pretty quickly, and they also were able to ally themselves with these rebel forces in the Philippines so that they could support them and support each other, and it led to a very quick victory in the Philippines. So now we're going to move over to Cuba. Again, here's that painting of old Uncle Sam protecting the native woman on the ground here with the Spanish back here. So one of the things that came out of this was the Teller Amendment. So before this conflict was even completed, the U.S. agreed to let Cuba have their independence. And the agreement was that once Cuba was free, the United States would leave the government and control the island to its people. So essentially they would be able to self-govern, and the United States would go in there, they would send troops, but once the war is won, then Cuba would have its independence. Now, it's important to note that this Teller Amendment only is applying to Cuba right now. This does not apply to the Philippines. There was no such agreement made with the Philippines. So one of the first things here is that the United States soldiers, they weren't prepared to fight. The last major war that the United States had fought was the Civil War, which is about 30, almost 40 years ago at this point. And so these uniforms and a lot of supplies and stuff are from the Civil War. So imagine today if soldiers were fighting with equipment from the 1980s. That's the equivalent of what these soldiers were doing. They were strapping on gear and using supplies that maybe their parents or even grandparents might have used in their wars. The other thing about this is these Civil War uniforms are made of wool. A lot of obviously the fighting in the Civil War happened here in the United States where the climate is very different. So imagine wearing this wool outfit in the middle of the jungles of Cuba. It's not comfortable, guys. Okay? So it's a very important piece of this. If you've ever been outside in hot, sweaty clothing, that's what these people are doing 24/7. And again, the supplies are from the Civil War. The United States hadn't really built up a lot of these supplies and stuff like that since that period. So you're going out there and you're trying to cook with 40-year-old pots and pans, using 40-year-old canteens, stuff like that. And of course, food was not great. um, this is kind of the very early period of canning food, which is a great process to preserve it, but the food that was actually preserved was disgusting. They called it embalmed beef. So what embalming is when you embalm a body, and so they were comparing it essentially to dead bodies. So not very appetizing. So combine all these things. Think about fighting in a foreign land, in a hot jungle climate, tropical climate, with all of this stuff. So the Americans were not prepared to fight. So who were these fighters? Well, they're a group of men called the Rough Riders, and they were led and organized by Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt was a Rough Rider, and he would eventually be president of the United States. But these Rough Riders were a group of young men. Typically, they were 18 to mid 20s, and these are college athletes, cowboys, ranchers, miners. So these men that are used to typically hard physical labor, these are the men that are called up. So they're called the Rough Riders because they were expected to ride on horses, but those horses never really showed up. Only a few hundred of these men ended up with horses, so most of their fighting would happen on foot. So it's kind of a misnomer here, the term Rough Riders. But it's a cool name, right? And you got Teddy Roosevelt here standing in the center of all of these kind of rough and tumble men, these college athletes, cowboys, ranchers, miners, which most of these men, a lot of these men were enlisted in the military, and then there was also a lot of volunteers. So a lot of these men were volunteered as well. So if we're thinking again, kind of the popularity of this is where these concepts of masculinity and these ideas of what is it to be a man kind of start coming about here in the United States. These cowboys and stuff like that volunteering to go fight in a war. So Teddy Roosevelt himself is a really interesting character. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about Teddy Roosevelt. But he resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So remember we talked about him yesterday a little bit, but this led to a huge boost in his popularity. Basically, he was saying, I'm going to step down from my position, my very high, lofty position in the U.S. government, and I'm going to go lead troops on the ground. And again, this is a huge popularity boost for him. He was seen as an American kind of folk hero at this point. So, what's the American strategy? Well, the goal here is to capture the port city of Santiago. Santiago is down here on the very southern tip of Cuba. And to do this, Santiago is surrounded by hills. So if we look at this map down here, Santiago is surrounded by these hills. And what they did is they blockaded it. So that means that they pulled ships in, didn't let any ships out, and then they surrounded it. So they fought on these hills all around the city here. You can see where these hills are right here. And they were finally able to capture it after a 4-hour fight. And they were able to capture 2 other hills that day. So this group was fought by the Rough Riders as well as the Buffalo Soldiers. So the Buffalo Soldiers are kind of a really interesting group. The Buffalo Soldiers were the original cavalry regiment that was made up entirely of African Americans. So the military was still segregated at this point. So they would have white regiments and black regiments. And the Buffalo Soldiers were a cavalry regiment of entirely African Americans. So they played a huge part in this war as well. So this entire battle is known as the Battle of San Juan Hill. Even though it was multiple hills during that day, the Battle of San Juan Hill is what it is known as. So it kind of was the opposite here of what happened in the Philippines. The United States took the ground advantage first. So they took those hills, they took the city of Santiago, and then they focused on the sea. They focused on the battle at sea. So it kind of flip-flops from the Battle of the Philippines. And eventually the United States sank the entire Spanish fleet in this battle. So again, another crushing blow to the Spanish fleet by the American fleet. And 2 weeks later, the Spanish troops in Cuba surrender. So again, very, very fast war, especially during this time period where there's not aircraft, there's not high-speed boats. 2 weeks, the Spanish surrender in Cuba. So, why was fighting in Cuba so difficult? So, kind of take that in, think about that for a bit, and we'll review here in a second. Okay, So, if we recall, first of all, think about the supplies and the preparation. The United States military was not really prepared to be fighting not only a war, but especially a war in a hot, kind of humid tropical climate like Cuba. A lot of their supplies were from the Civil War era, which is almost 40 years ago at this point, which is over 30 years ago at this point, almost 40 years ago. And it's really not made for that. Plus the fact that it's 40-year-old gear trying to fight a modern war. So that's difficult, as well as just the climate of Cuba itself makes things difficult. It is tropical, a lot of hills, a lot of mountains as well. So that kind of led all to this difficulty. But despite that, the Americans gain a very quick victory. So what comes from this? Well, the Treaty of Paris is what is signed. So I always find it interesting that, Paris is over in France. What does France have to do with the United States and Spain? A lot of times we'll see places like Paris, other countries in Europe be kind of the middle ground. So France wasn't allied with Spain, they weren't allied with the United States. They said, okay, we'll host this conference and you can hash out your differences here and come to a treaty. So it becomes the Treaty of Paris because that is where these ambassadors ended up meeting. So Spain gives all of their claims up to Cuba. They also cede Puerto Rico to the United States, which is kind of interesting. There was no fighting in Puerto Rico. That wasn't on the original list. And so the United States gets Puerto Rico, and then they also turn over the Philippines. So if you remember yesterday we talked about the last two Spanish holdings in the New World was Cuba and Puerto Rico. And now they've lost both of those to the United States, as well as the Philippines over in Asia. Now, the Philippines, they didn't get off scot-free for that. We had to pay $20 million, but for an entire island chain, that is a cheap, cheap sum. So, what are the results of this war? Well, this is kind of the first step of the United States moving into the ranks of imperialist nations. So if you remember back to world history, we talked a lot about how these nations were kind of competing and jockeying for land in places like Africa and Asia, mainly like Germany and France and Great Britain. They were all kind of competing for this, and the United States was kind of left out. And so at this point, a lot of that land is already taken up, but this is the United States' first steps into imperialism, into the ranks of the imperialist nations. So they move into the imperialist nation, in kind of this list of imperialist nations, these world powers. They get more bases for trading and supplying. So the Philippines is a major, major base for resupplying for Asia. And of course, Cuba and Puerto Rico are massive parts of controlling the Caribbean. And then eventually this would lead to the acquisition of Samoa. So Samoa is another island over in the Pacific, kind of in the same region as the Philippines. The consequences of this, $250 million to spend. And this isn't an insignificant sum because you have to remember this is back in, 19th century dollars. So it's quite a bit of money. 2,000 soldiers do die. So a 5-month span for that short of a war, that's actually a pretty violent war, even though it happened pretty quickly. Most of these deaths, though, were from yellow fever, which is a disease that is spread by mosquitoes. So most of the fatalities from this war weren't even from the fighting with the Spanish. It was mainly from yellow fever. So, think about this question. What did the United States gain as a result of the Spanish-American War? All right, let's recall they gained three things, three islands. They gained Cuba, they gained Puerto Rico, and they gained the Philippines. So remember what the agreement was with Cuba, though. We had the Teller Amendment. So as soon as the war is over, they would leave Cuba. So they do so. They maintain Puerto Rico. The question then becomes, what do we do with the Philippines? Because remember, there's not an amendment for this, and there's a massive native population there, but it's a pretty sweet prize over in Asia and would really help out these imperialist notions that the United States was having at this time. So this became a major question. Do we annex it? So do we take it? Or do we not do that? Do we let the Philippines rule themselves? This cartoon is kind of showing that as well. You have this clearly white man showing, and it says, it's kind of cut off here, showing the light to the Filipinos. So just in case you didn't know this guy's Filipino, he's got it right on his coat right here. And it's literally the light of civilization that's sitting on freedom, education, justice, commerce. So again, it's not subtle. It's showing you exactly what it's saying. He is showing this native man the light of civilization. So this is the white man's burden right here in text. Okay, so there's a debate on this. So Congress debates this for a long time because this kind of becomes a tipping point here. This is kind of right on that line there. So the pro-annexation side, those people that want to annex the Philippines, and again, we have to get back to the mindset of 1898 Americans, not our modern day Americans, but these people back then that have been inundated with this information. So this first one here is the white man's burden. The fact that the United States had a duty to spread its values overseas to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. Okay? So again, basically trying to spread your culture because you believe it is superior. This white man's burden. The second one is the economic and strategic value. This is located right on the road to China. Okay? Remember, the United States was having issues with resupplying in the war over there. Well, if you had a base in the Philippines, that would be the perfect place if you're wanting to trade with China. Not only China, but Japan, Vietnam, these Asian countries, the Philippines is a perfect location for that. And then, of course, seizing the day. So this is kind of that social Darwinism slant to this. If we don't take this, then someone else is just going to. The French might move in, or the British might move in. So why should it be us? If someone's going to control them, then it should be us. And of course, you have the anti-annexation debate. It violates the ideals of democracy. Remember, the United States gets into this war to fight on behalf of Cuban independence. That's a major part of this, is so that Cuba can be free. And they give that to the Cubans, but what's that say if you turn around and take that away from the Filipinos? So it goes against this foundation of the American system. Also discrimination. There was a major concern, especially among African Americans, that the discrimination that was going on in the United States, which we're going to talk about in our next unit, would spread and that it would become more commonplace in the world. So that's a major concern here. And then, of course, opening the door. That these new immigrants would come in from the Philippines and they would come take jobs from factory workers. So there are arguments for and against, some positive, some negative. So what happens? Well, the annexation gets approved. It is a narrow passage. So the Congress debates this for a very long time, and it narrowly passes that the Philippines would be annexed by the United States. So the United States takes control. The Filipinos are infuriated. They believe they're just trading one ruler for the other. So we can see this cartoon here. Troubles with may follow an imperial policy. So again, incredibly racist cartoon that is showing the Filipinos as these natives that only throw spears and throwing it at the Congress of the United States here. So what happens is these rebels, led by Aguinaldo, take control of government, and he takes control as president. He sets up his government, and he is willing to take military action if need be. Fighting eventually breaks out. Again, it's kind of inevitable at this point that fighting breaks out. Now, unlike the Spanish-American War, this war lasts for 3 years. And this is a violent, brutal war. It lasts for 3 years, and it is happening in the jungles of the Philippines. So the Philippines are a very kind of jungled, hot, humid environment. And this fighting here lasts for 3 years, and eventually Aguinaldo, so this rebel leader that was once our ally in the Spanish-American War, was captured and forced out of power in 1903. 4,000 U.S. soldiers died. So twice as many soldiers died in keeping the territory they gained from the Spanish-American War than actually fighting in the Spanish-American War. And over 200,000 Filipinos died. So 220,000 Filipinos died. So again, another very bloody conflict. So here's a couple cartoons here. This left one here, the Senate Philippine bill offers great inducement to the bad Filipino. So again, these cartoons are not subtle. It shows the Americans over here with the good Filipino up on the wall with them, the good Filipinos up on the wall with peace and land for people, public improvement, education, prosperity, and they're looking down at the bad Filipino with things like hunger and disease and torture, stuff like that, living in kind of the jungle down here. It even says all kinds of trouble here. So he's literally looking down on this native person. And over here we have Uncle Sam once again representing the United States with arrows in his back, and the native here with a flag of surrender flying. So, what are the results of this? Well, Congress puts a U.S. governor in charge. The Filipinos had a voice in governing, but they put a United States governor in charge. By 1916, Filipinos won the right to elect both houses of their legislature, and by 1946, the United States finally grants the Philippines their full independence. So, it took a very long time, almost 50 years, before the Philippines actually gained their own freedom. This is a really interesting cartoon over here. So we have Uncle Sam here, and look at all the stuff he's carrying. First of all, some of it's labeled bridges, steel rails, education, religion, mills, medicine. We can see all this stuff that he is carrying on his back. And this is the United States here, and we have China over here. So it says wanted, all these machines, wanted, trolley lines. And we have this very happy looking, which is a caricature of a Chinese person standing here welcoming the United States. But right between here is the Philippines. The Philippines was a stepping stone, or seen as a stepping stone, to Asia. This is basically the gateway to Asia. All right. So, why do you think the U.S. granted independence to the Philippines in 1946? Take a minute to consider that. And that is really all I've got. So make sure we fill out that that chart in the that I showed you at the beginning. And other than that, have a great day.